The funeral had been beautiful, but hauntingly empty. Stacy stood at the graveside as the mourners dispersed, their black-clad figures slowly fading into the gray mist that enshrouded the cemetery. She watched them go, friends, family, townsfolk, all of them shaken by the brutal murder of Clara Benson, the shining light of their close-knit community. Stacy felt hollow inside, an emptiness that had nothing to do with grief. She knew she should feel sorrow, guilt, something, but there was only a cold sense of satisfaction. Clara, her lifelong best friend, was finally gone. The one person who had simultaneously lifted Stacy up and held her down for as long as she could remember. The one person she had loved and hated in equal measure. As the cemetery workers began shoveling dirt into the grave with mechanical detachment, Stacy turned and made her way down the path, her black heels clicking on the cobblestones. Up ahead, she spotted a familiar figure leaning against the iron gate, hands stuffed in his pockets, eyes downcast. Mike, Clara's on-again, off-again boyfriend and the prime suspect in her murder. Stacy quickened her pace, pulling her coat tighter around herself to ward off the damp chill. As she approached, Mike looked up, meeting her gaze with red-rimmed eyes. "Stacy, I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I wasn't sure if I should come, but I had to pay my respects, regardless of what people might think." Stacy placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Of course you should be here, Mike. You loved her. We both did. And no one with any sense actually believes you could have hurt Clara." "The police seem to think otherwise," Mike said bitterly. "They've been questioning me non-stop, digging into my past, my relationship with Clara. It's like they've already decided I'm guilty." "You have to stay strong," Stacy urged. "The truth will come out. In the meantime, we have to stick together. Clara would want that." Mike nodded slowly. "You're right. We're the only ones who really knew her. The real her." He stared off into the distance for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was low and determined. "Stacy, I can't just sit back and let the police pin this on me. I need to find out what really happened to Clara. Will you help me?" Stacy hesitated. Getting involved in the investigation was risky. Certain secrets came to light, but looking into Mike's pleading eyes, she knew she couldn't refuse him. "Of course," she said, mustering a small smile. "We'll get to the bottom of this together. For Clara." As they walked out of the cemetery side by side, Stacy felt a flicker of unease. The tangled web of love, jealousy, and resentment between herself, Clara, and Mike ran deep. Tugging on one thread could unravel everything. But there was no going back now. The die was cast. "This is intense," Stacy said, eyeing the collage of notes, photos, and newspaper clippings covering the basement wall of Mike's parents' house. "You've really thrown yourself into this investigation." "I have to," Mike replied grimly, tapping a finger against a timeline he'd drawn. "The police aren't seeing the full picture. There are too many unanswered questions." Stacy moved closer, scanning the meticulously organized evidence. Her stomach clenched as she spotted a photo of Clara's house, the porch lights glowing in the darkness. The last night of Clara's life. "So what do we know so far?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Mike launched into a recap. Clara left work around 5:30 that evening. She would have gotten home by 5:45 or so. Then she went about her usual Thursday night self-care routine: dinner, bubble bath, face mask. "You know how religious she was about that." Stacy nodded. Those indulgent self-care nights had started out as a bonding ritual for the two of them back in high school, sipping wine and gossiping until the early hours. But over time, Clara had made it clear that Stacy's presence was no longer welcome, politely but firmly excluding her from that weekly retreat. Just one of many small cuts to their friendship over the years. Around 8 p.m., a neighbor saw a woman arrive at Clara's house and go inside. Mike continued. "We don't know who it was. They didn't get a good look. But we know Clara didn't like having visitors on her self-care nights. Even I wasn't allowed over. So whoever this mystery woman was, it must have been important. Or it was someone Clara trusted enough to make an exception for." Stacy mused, tapping a finger to her lips. "A suspect, The possibilities raced through her mind. Right? Mike agreed. Then sometime between 8:30 and 10:30, Clara was killed, stabbed multiple times. No signs of forced entry, so she likely knew her attacker. That's a 2-hour window, Stacy said. Kind of a long time for a visit, especially if it was just a quick pop-in. What do you think they were doing? I don't know, Mike said, frustration edging into his voice. Talking? Arguing? Clara could be stubborn as hell when she wanted to be. If it was a confrontation of some kind, he trailed off, his eyes distant. Stacy watched him carefully. There was a brittleness to Mike that hadn't been there before. His easy charm replaced by a tightly coiled intensity. Losing Clara had broken something in him. Stacy wondered if he would ever be the same. We need more information, Mike said abruptly, snapping back to the present. I have to go to the house. Look for clues. Anything the police might have missed. Stacy's heart stuttered in her chest. The house, the scene of the crime. Going back there, seeing it all again. Mike, it's still an active crime scene, she protested weakly. We can't just go snooping around. He held up a key, a ghost of his old roguish smile playing across his lips. We can if I have a key. Perks of being the not-quite-live-in boyfriend. Stacy's mind raced as she weighed the risks. If they got caught, it would look very bad, especially for Mike. But the desperate need in his eyes tugged at her, wearing down her resistance. Fine, she relented. But we go together. Safety in numbers and all that. The smile Mike flashed her was a shadow of the easy grin that used to make her pulse jump. But it was enough. Together, they headed out to Mike's car, determined to uncover the truth. The house loomed before them in the darkness. A once welcoming sight turned sinister. Stacy's palms were slick with sweat as she followed Mike up the walk, every step leaden with dread. Mike slid his key into the lock, the tumblers giving way with an ominous click. As they stepped inside, Stacy was struck by how ordinary everything looked. Clara's jacket hung by the door, her shoes neatly placed on the mat. A stack of mail sat on the side table, waiting to be opened. It was as if Clara had just stepped out and would be back any minute to chastise them for snooping. But the red-brown stain marring the plush white carpeting in the living room told a different story. Mike pulled 2 pairs of rubber gloves from his backpack and handed one to Stacy. She stretched the thin latex over her hands, the action surreal. Playing detective in her murdered best friend's house. They moved through the rooms methodically, careful not to disturb anything. Stacy tried to focus on scanning for clues, but her eyes kept catching on painful reminders of the life Clara had lived. The framed photos of their friendship that dotted the walls. The copy of Stacy's favorite book lying on the coffee table. A Christmas gift from Clara 2 years ago. The detritus of a bond that had shaped her entire world. In the bedroom, Mike stooped to examine something on the floor. Stacy hung back, unwilling to breach the threshold of that most intimate space. She listened to him rummaging around, her heart pounding with irrational fear. A sharp intake of breath from Mike jolted her into action. She stepped cautiously into the room to find him kneeling by the bed, his shoulders rigid with tension. What is it? What did you find? Slowly, Mike turned to face her. In his gloved hand, he held a beaded bracelet, the delicate strands stained with rust-colored smears. Stacy's blood turned to ice in her veins. It was the friendship bracelet Clara had made for her back in high school. The one she always wore, even long after they'd grown apart. The one she thought she'd lost weeks ago. Where did you get that? Stacy whispered, her voice shaking. I've been looking everywhere for it. Cut the crap, Stacy, Mike snapped, his eyes hard. I saw you wearing this the day before Clara died. What the hell is it doing here, covered in blood? What did you do? Stacy stumbled back a step, her mind reeling. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Mike was never meant to find out. Panic clawed at her throat as she scrambled for an explanation. I don't know, she stammered. I must have left it here the last time I visited. Maybe Clara was wearing it when... She couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. Mike rose to his feet, his face a mask of horror and dawning realization. "Stop lying," he said coldly. "I know you, Stacy. I know when you're hiding something. Tell me the truth. Now." The command in his tone broke her. The weight of years of secrets and resentments came crashing down, the words pouring out of her in a torrent she was powerless to stop. "She made me do it," Stacy said, her voice cracking. "All those years of keeping me in her shadow, making me feel small, holding me back. I couldn't take it anymore." The shock on Mike's face slowly morphed into revulsion as Stacy spilled out the ugly story. The confrontation, the unintended violence, the panicked cover-up. "I didn't mean to kill her," Stacy insisted desperately, reaching for him. "But it's done now. We're free. Don't you see? I did this for you. For us." Mike recoiled from her touch as if scalded. "There is no us," he spat. "You're a murderer, Stacy. A monster. I'm going to the police. I'm turning you in." Terror surged through Stacy's veins, icy and electric. She couldn't let that happen. A life behind bars, her name forever synonymous with brutal betrayal, it was unthinkable. In a daze, she watched her hand close around the grip of the pistol in her purse, the metal cold against her skin. She couldn't even remember picking it up before leaving the house. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that," she said softly, raising the gun to point at Mike's chest with a hand that barely trembled. "Jesus Christ, Stacy, what are you doing?" Mike held his hands up in panicked surrender, his eyes wide and pleading. "Put the gun down. Let's talk about this." But Stacy barely heard him over the roaring in her ears. Her world was crumbling down around her, the intricate latticework of lies giving way at last. There was no going back, no undoing what she'd done. All that was left was survival. "I loved you, Mike," she said, barely recognizing her own voice. It sounded distant, detached. "I loved you so much, and she took you from me, just like she took everything else." "This isn't love," Mike said, slowly edging backwards. "This is insanity. Clara was your best friend. Whatever issues you had, this isn't how you deal with them. Please, Stacy. It's not too late to make this right." For a moment, Stacy wavered. A part of her longed to throw herself into Mike's arms, to let him hold her and tell her it would be all right. But a larger part, the part that had seethed in Clara's shadow for far too long, knew better. "It was too late the moment Clara stole you away from me," she said flatly. "The moment she decided her wants mattered more than my needs, more than my whole life." Grief and guilt warred on Mike's face. "I'm so sorry, Stacy. I never meant to hurt you. Neither did Clara. But this is madness. You need help." "No," Stacy said, a strange calm settling over her. "I just need you." The gun barked once, twice, 3 times, the shots deafening in the close confines of the bedroom. Mike crumpled, his body folding in on itself as crimson bloomed across his chest. It was over so quickly, shockingly, brutally efficient. Stacy stood frozen for a long moment, ears ringing, the acrid scent of gunpowder heavy in her nostrils. Then, mechanically, she set about staging the scene. She pressed the gun into Mike's cooling hand, curling his fingers around the grip. His phone she used to type out a hasty confession and suicide note. The guilt over murdering Clara had driven him to take his own life. It would be plausible enough, given the suspicion already swirling around him. Her hands shook only slightly as she collected the few traces of herself from the room. The blood-soaked friendship bracelet she slipped into her pocket. She would not forget it this time. As she turned to leave, she paused, looking down at Mike's still form. He could have been sleeping, his face slack and peaceful in death. On impulse, she bent and pressed a soft kiss to his lips. "Goodbye, my love," she whispered. "I'll keep you safe now. No one will ever come between us again." The walk back to Mike's house was a surreal blur. Stacy moved as if in a dream, her feet carrying her forward of their own accord. Everything felt distant, muffled, like she was viewing the world through a thick pane of glass. In Mike's basement, she meticulously dismantled the sprawling evidence wall, piling the photos and documents into a backpack. She paused before the timeline, tracing her finger along the line that marked the end of Clara's life. The end of everything. Shouldering the backpack, Stacy slipped out to her car and drove home through the quiet streets. It was late now, the town deep in slumber, oblivious to the Greek tragedy that had just played out in its midst. At home, Stacy built a small fire in a metal trash can in her backyard. One by one, she fed the photos and papers to the flames, watching as the evidence of her crime crumbled into ash. She sat vigil by the embers until dawn began to lighten the sky, her mind turning over the jagged shards of her fractured life. Everything she had known, everything she had been, was gone now, immolated on the pyre of her own making. But like a phoenix, she would rise from the ashes. She would don a black dress and play the grieving friend at Mike's funeral, a flawless portrait of sorrow and shock. She would move through a world that no longer held any piece of her heart, an actress in a role that never ended. And in the dark hours of the night, she would remember the girl she had been, the love she had lost, the blood on her hands that would never wash clean. The shadows were her home now, and in them, she would endure. A specter, a cautionary tale, a warning of the darkness that lurks in the human heart. Stacy Hartwell died the night she plunged a knife into her best friend's chest. But something new was born in her place, something colder, harder, infinitely more ruthless. The world would never see her coming.